Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans Reacts. And on today's episode, we have yet of the same, more aggravating topics to talk about. And today's episode, we're talking about how 35 years later, some California tribes are fighting to reclaim their ancestral remains. And this, unfortunately, is not a unique study to this tribe, where in Santa Ynez, a lot of indigenous tribes are struggling to try and reclaim the remains of their ancestors, along with sacred items that are held in museums, universities, and other institutions across the country. And this comes after Nakia Zavala, the historic preservation officer and cultural director of the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, that is really working to try and reclaim their indigenous remains. And this is a common trend across the country where curators and museum officials have been dragging their feet in complying with the 1990 law, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which stated that all institutions should try to make a good faith effort into returning indigenous remains or burial goods. And this was contingent on the institutions following that guidance and trying to figure out the cultural identity of many of the remains and items that they have. And a lot of institutions just kind of went, well, we're not going to be able to figure out, so we can't return them. However, Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Interior, released new guidance recently that has mandated a lot of institutions actually start putting that effort forth.
And this article itself focuses primarily on the struggle of the Chumash to, have their ancestors returned to them in California. But it is a nationwide phenomenon. It is a nationwide struggle to repatriate these remains, mostly because a lot of institutions remain unwilling to actively begin the process.
And for the record, there's about 128,000 ancestral remains that are still within institutions nationwide. And they are held at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Field Museum in Chicago, Harvard University, and some are even beyond the country.
Yeah, and of the there's actually a very nice map that ABC7 has that shows just how much there is in the United States of America. There's an estimated at least 90,000 ancestral remains and 700,000 funerary objects associated with them pending repatriation. And one of the big things about the ABC7 map is you can see the three biggest offending states are number one, Illinois, number two, Ohio, and number three, California have
Yikes.
the largest quantity that are just pending return. It's a very nice distribution map where you can see, like no state is completely white in this chart. There's no state that's just blank because it has zero. Everyone's got something.
Well, actually, zero would be more dark blue, which some states have some smaller numbers, some smaller amounts. Like a lot of the northern states are in double digits, but it's not perfect. And in this article, it actually talks about how in a lot of cases, curators or other museum professionals are actively against NAGPRA and actively have been fighting against it. And what they do is they basically say we can't identify the remains, we're unable to return them. And that's how about 90,000 of that 120,000 are currently. And the Santa Ynez Band, they have been working really diligently to try and return their ancestral remains. And they have worked with over 80 museums on the return of 2,000 ancestors and hundreds of thousands of funerary objects, but they still estimate that there are thousands out there that still have yet to be returned.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the big things with this, number that the Chumash have been able to um, receive, a lot of that comes from a single wave where they're able to more or less pry the door open on UCLA in 2016, where after 2 years of back and forth with the university, they were able to, re- you know, receive about 1,700 ancestral remains from the university because the majority or I shouldn't say majority, but a huge quantity have been held in universities. I believe some 16,000 in UC schools alone.
Which is interesting because in the UC school system, it shows that they had possessed more than 16,000 remains in all, and as of May 30th, more than 6,000 have still yet to be returned. And the bulk of that comes from UCLA, which has made significant progress on repatriation, having repatriated 99% of ancestors to their descendant tribes, whereas 4 out of 7 UC schools have returned less than 50% in their collection. And there is a woman who I don't know if I should name or not, that is a professor in one of these schools, has actively flaunted working with native remains and actively fights against repatriation. Not a great person, personally.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're not going to go into personal attacks here, but just,
It's not a good look,
standing
regardless.
standing against NAGPRA is a pretty easy way to get yourself a bad guy card around here.
That's a pretty weird hill to die on because what this really stems and where a lot of people argue against NAGPRA is they argue against the research that has yet to be conducted. They want to maintain the remains so they could do additional invasive or destructive studies on the remains to try and ascertain additional information. However, a lot of times we're not consulting the tribes. We're not having these open door conversations with them. We're not actually trying to figure out what the tribe's desires are in these situations. We're just doing the work. And now there's been a huge push to try and rectify those wrongs and to try and work to correct them and to do better in the future. And the argument that research would stop entirely is entirely fabricated because there are a lot of tribes out there that conduct great research themselves, but they're able to conduct the research themselves. They're able to make decisions on what is okay or not okay to do to their ancestors' remains. That's
And
something
fun
that I
fact,
just don't think we should have a discussion on.
yeah. And fun fact, grave robbing is not okay. Period.
And that's really what
With
this
a lot of
was
this.
sanctioned grave robbing from professionals.
Yeah, I believe at some point in the article, one of the representatives for UCLA gives a nod to that, shall we say, manner of acquisition, stating that it is these were not sourced in a way that we understand to be ethical, and thus we must return them.
And that's really what a lot of this argument boils down to and really makes a stand, and something where I feel very passionately about is we should leave the research questions, those discussions to the tribes themselves because it is their ancestors. It's the same conversation that if someone went up to the cemetery where your grandparents were buried and starts digging up bodies and selling them on the roadside, you would also be rightfully pissed off. And that's what a lot of this is they feel like it's their grandparents. They feel like it's their parents whose remains are in these institutions. And yeah, I think it's morally objectively wrong to deny that.
And
But I think that's
and
oh, go
yeah,
on.
and there's one key point I wanted to make here is handing over the reins of research to the tribes does not mean that like we lose all information on these people. You know the tribes are oftentimes very happy to share their ancestral way of life. This is how we did things here. Share the discoveries and knowledge of archaeology and history with the rest of the world. This isn't some dark void that they're going to lock up and hide away forever, saying no one can ever know about us. It's just shifting the narrative. It's not an end to no one can ever learn about the Chumash ever again because the Chumash have reclaimed all their artifacts.
Well, and
That's
it's
not
also
how this
just
works.
controlling the narrative too, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I think we're gonna end today's episode. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know what you thought down below, and we'll see you in the next one.